In 1946, the US Navy sent 4,700 men, aircraft carriers, submarines, and fighter planes to Antarctica. Officially, it was a science and logistics mission. But what did the man in charge mean when he later mentioned the lands beyond the poles? What did they see? And why did they leave early? Let's talk about Operation Highjump. What it was, why the military sent such a force to Antarctica of all places, and the knowledge gaps that led to some of today's craziest theories, such as the Hollow Earth theory. What was the operation, and why did it lead to such speculation? Leading into the Cold War, America and the Soviet Union faced off, vying for supremacy, both sides believing the other's ideology was dangerous, believing after the Second World War that one or the other would push and expand. The US feared the spread of communism, and the USSR feared the capitalist encirclement. This was a time of rivalry, a precursor to the Great Space Race, and it was clear that both the United States and USSR were entering a technological and military competition. Once the US had atomic weapons by 1945, the USSR raced to get them as well. Both sides were developing intercontinental range aircraft and ramping up research. By 1947, planners on both sides assumed the look of the future wars would be decided by technology, not just troop numbers. Technological supremacy led to many scientific incursions, both sides trying to push the boundaries on research. The Cold War was a technology race in many ways: land, air, sea, and even space. With heightened tensions, the push to further global influence, and the race to see who would discover what first, this set a perfect stage for the exploration of Antarctica. By 1946, Antarctica was still one of the least known places on Earth. Its coastline was mostly mapped, charted by British, Norwegian, and American expeditions, but the interior was still largely unexplored, pretty unmapped. It was already established that Antarctica is the coldest, driest, and windiest continent, covered by a thick ice sheet 2 to 3 miles deep in some areas, and even containing mountain ranges buried under the ice. But what else was there? Both the USSR and United States have previously sent Antarctic expeditions, notably America's Service Expedition in 1939, and the USSR's different whaling fleets with mini science teams roaming the waters. So, as the technological arms race was ramping up, and as both powers vied for influence over the seas, both understood that Antarctica had strategic and scientific value, wanting to win and wanting supremacy. Government-led projects eyed the frozen lands. Everything mentioned so far led to the birth of Antarctica's largest operation and expedition to date. Operation Highjump. Operation Highjump consisted of 4,700 men, 13 ships, and 33 aircraft. This included a command ship, an aircraft carrier, 2 destroyers, 2 icebreakers, 2 seaplane tenders, 2 supply ships, 2 tankers, and a submarine. Personnel assigned to the expedition included meteorologists, zoologists, physicists, and experts from oceanographic institutes. Of course, not to mention the many Navy military personnel and military subgroups, such as the Seabees, known for their military construction projects. And who better to lead this operation than Richard Evelyn Byrd Jr. He was a naval officer and aviator, mostly known for his polar expeditions and handling of polar logistics for the US Navy. Even claimed to have been the first man to fly to both North and South Poles. Operation Highjump being his 4th official expedition back to Antarctica. He served as the Rear Admiral for this mission, accompanied by another Rear Admiral, Richard E. Admiral Byrd was in charge of the operation as a whole. and Admiral Cruzen was selected to command Task Force 68, which was the vast majority of the resources assigned to this operation, including most of the personnel and vehicles. Both men were decorated war heroes, Byrd having the Navy Extinguished Service Medal, having a Legion of Merit, a Distinguished Flying Cross, and numerous foreign honors for polar exploration and military service, as Cruzen had a Navy Cross, a Legion of Merit, a Distinguished Flying Cross, and World War II campaign medals. He even commanded heavy cruisers during World War II, both being experts in polar logistics and naval operations. Perfect for this operation. So, now we know what resources and officials were assigned to this operation. But what were the goals? On paper, the stated objectives were to train personnel and evaluate ships, aircraft, vehicles, clothing, fuels, and maintenance procedures in Antarctic conditions. To determine the feasibility costs and risks of establishing, supplying, and operating permanent or seasonal bases in Antarctica, and to identify candidate sites for such bases. To develop and standardize techniques for constructing, maintaining, and utilizing air bases on snow and shelf ice, which would include runway preparation, ski-equipped aircraft operations, cold weather servicing, and applicability of such techniques for usage within Greenland. To conduct wide area photographic reconnaissance and mapping of coasts and inland ice, to expand records in electromagnetic, geological, geographic, hydrographic, and meteorological fields. Who's to also consolidate and extend potential United States sovereignty over the largest practicable area of the Antarctic continent. And finally, to run supplemental tasks associated with Operation Nanook, which was a smaller equivalent operation stemming off the eastern lands of Greenland, to learn what they can in Antarctica and reapply all these lessons to other places around the Earth. To do all of this, they decided on one course of action: to establish Little America 4. As mentioned, the United States has had several expeditions at this point, some of which were to establish small research and logistic bases around Antarctica to better learn how to establish a foothold in the ice. Said previous expeditions leading up to Operation Highjump consisted of creating 3 bases each called Little America, 1 to 3, which each were built and studied under a single Antarctic season, then left or set adrift to sink into the ocean. For each of the previous expeditions to build out these Little Americas, these United States research facilities would consist of around 50 to 105 personnel to temporarily be there and conduct their research. Under Operation Highjump, the 4th expedition to conduct and create a base as such, Little America 4 was to have 4,700 personnel. Little America 4, the main base of operations for Operation Highjump, was built late 1946 and was operational for 8 to 10 weeks, abandoned shortly after. In these weeks, personnel conducted mass aerial photography, they mapped hundreds to thousands of square miles of previously uncharted ice and coastlines, and surface-level data was collected from meteorological and geological observations. Many logistical and training exercises were conducted. So, given these facts, how and why did such an operation lead and contribute into some of today's craziest theories? What did Byrd claim to see out there? And what did he mean when he warned against potential dangers from lands beyond the poles? The short answer is knowledge gaps. Operation Highjump was planned to last 6 months, not 8 to 10 weeks. The official explanation for its early termination was inclement weather, ice conditions, and safety risks. Antarctic expeditions expect severe weather, no single catastrophic event is cited publicly, and the internal decision-making discussions were thinly documented. So, why did leadership decide the risk threshold was suddenly unacceptable and they pulled out all 4,700 troops in less than 3 months? given this was Byrd's fourth major expedition out of a list of many, and both admirals being part of this operation were experts in polar logistics. How was weather here unplanned for? We see in later operations, such as Operation Highjump's sister operation, Operation Deep Freeze, conducted in 1955 to 56, the US Navy successfully established permanent bases within Antarctica. The successful creation of McMurdo Station and Amundsen Scott South Pole Station showed the US was always interested in staying around, and such an operation actually faced worse weather conditions than High Jump. So weather didn't seem too bad. So, as we saw, not only did other operations going to the Antarctic were actually successes despite the weather being worse for those missions, we also need to mention that all the expeditions before High Jump were essentially successes too. Each of the Little Americas were built and destroyed as planned, each being their own expedition, and each being in their own given time frames, like they were there for the full time they were set to be. With overly qualified leadership, previous data to work off of, only successes leading to this one early termination, it's hard to believe it was just weather that stopped this large task force. Speaking of the task force, why was such a massive military force utilized here? As mentioned, 4,700 personnel with 13 ships including an entire aircraft carrier were used. This scale exceeds what's needed for mapping alone. Comparable nations, such as Britain and later the USSR, conducted polar science with far fewer assets. What contingencies were they preparing for that required such a scale? The British Antarctic Survey, the BAS, conducted around this time, had the goal of long-term polar science research as well, but only utilized small ships, sled teams, and light aircraft. Operation Windmill, from 1947 to 1948, was a different US Navy-based operation that also conducted surveying and ground control work with logistics research, all in Antarctica as well. They utilized a much smaller force of around 1,500 personnel. Still much larger than previous expeditions. The previous three Little Americas, set up by Admiral Byrd himself, only had 50 to 120. 1,500 is a lot compared to that, but still way less than the 4,700 number we see in Operation Highjump. And not only this, they were essentially going after the same objectives as Operation Highjump as well. And weather was not a canceling factor here. So as we see, all other expeditions and operations at the time to Antarctica or similar places were much smaller in scale, but were conducted for the same reasons. Some argue that mapping and scientific survey didn't require such scale. Such an operation was more akin to a military task force deployment rather than a research-based expedition. Perhaps it wasn't just logistics. You might need only 1,000 men to see if you could fully house a base in Antarctica, such as we saw in Windmill. So why were there over 4,000? Then come the incomplete or vague flight level details. We know they conducted extensive aerial photography. In the reports stemming from Operation Highjump, we see that many public summaries didn't include the flight logs, some routes, altitudes, and abort reasons are highly summarized, none of which are too granular. Given operational specifics exist, why aren't they fully shown in the public-facing summaries? Let's compare the lack of transparency to its sister operation, Operation Deep Freeze. Within Operation Deep Freeze, published records exist of flight routes, airstrip construction logs, cargo tonnage, and incidents reports. The same information isn't readily available for Operation Highjump. It's either summarized or glossed over. Going further, later, Cold War Arctic flights, such as the DEW supply missions, even saw their operations fully published. Later declassified logs included routes, altitudes, and abort reasons. Many declassified aerial surveillance operations were further discussed, and many were declassified around this time. Operation Deep Freeze and the many Cold War Arctic flights make Operation Highjump's public material surprisingly and unusually high level, or light by comparison. We know there were detailed flights during Highjump. Aircraft took tens of thousands of aerial photographs and flew extensive reconnaissance routes, and personal flight artifacts like signed mail covers show that specific flights did in fact take place. We see evidence that a lot was conducted, yet where is it? Why, in this specific operation, was everything either highly detailed or summarized or not too shown compared to its sister missions and any mission alike around this time? The next knowledge gap that we see with Operation Highjump is perhaps the most popular piece of the operation that creates the most speculation, and this is Admiral Byrd himself. Admiral Byrd was known to speak to foreign press, but the translations of what he discussed varied greatly. That, with no matching declassified memo to clarify points made, makes speculation rampant. For example, Byrd did an interview for the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio after Operation Highjump, where he warned the US about the possibility of an invasion by hostile aircraft coming from the polar regions. But as we will see later, this and other interviews have generated many mistranslations, and without any declassified memos, it can be hard to pinpoint what was actually said and why. Many quotes attribute him to saying that there are planes that could make it from the polar regions. But also, there are many translations that mentioned there's just a vague threat within the poles, within Antarctica itself. Let's take a look at perhaps his most popular quote related to this. "I'd like to see that land beyond the pole. The area beyond the pole is the center of the great unknown." But that quote has been noted to have been mistranslated. Many sources mentioned what he really said was simply that there was danger past the poles and nothing else. Nothing within the poles and no vague threat. He might have made explicit who he was talking about, but without direct translations or memos. Very hard to pinpoint. Compare this, what we see with other officials from the military that made similar remarks, but with clear and upfront existing memos or documents on what they have said. For example, General Curtis Lee May, part of Strategic Air Command, made many explicit warnings to Congress about Soviet bombers and their capabilities, and specifically, how they may go over the Arctic and the Antarctic. Memos exist of these hearings and others, with explicit mentions. Curtis Lee May was only one example of many head Navy or military members that specifically had their words saved on paper with explicit mention to what the threat was. Admiral Byrd, not General, was different. What we see here, and what's also interesting, was the underplaying of geopolitical competition. We know around this time that many countries were eyeing the Antarctica. The United States, the UK, and the USSR were among them. Territorial positions within the continent was only implied, not emphasized, and this led to speculation that Little America 4, the main base of operations for Operation Highjump, was about signaling presence, not the science conducted. Perhaps it was to simply set up military presence and influence alone. Operation Highjump happened right at the dawn of the Cold War. Around this time, the US raised bases in Greenland and Iceland. These bases were officially marked as weather and communication specific, but were later declassified to have been mostly, or actually been, utilized for Soviet bomber detection. This was one of the many examples where the US framed bases as scientific or logistical while quietly pursuing strategic positioning. Antarctica fixed the pattern that we see in Greenland and Iceland. Were those bases, a Little America 1 to 4, were they the same thing? Ambiguity, not having the full picture, is perhaps the largest reason for why speculation exists. Each of the gaps of information discussed led to many wild theories on what Operation Highjump actually was. Why was there such a sudden scale shift from Little America's 1 to 3, having only 50 to 120 personnel, going up to 4,700 on their 4th expedition? What did Admiral Byrd mean about his vague threats that he kept mentioning to foreign press whenever he was interviewed? And why didn't we get more flight logs and information when we know that information does exist somewhere? Why hasn't that been declassified compared to its sister operations? Or at least, why haven't they been declassified more? Why is the available information a little summarized? And why did they leave so early? Why were they only there for 6 to 10 weeks? They were supposed to be there for 6 to 10 months. As we see, there are a lot of knowledge gaps here. Let's cover some of the ideas, some of the theories that spawned off these knowledge gaps. Such ideas included, but were not limited to, Hollow Earth or Agartha theories, where Admiral Byrd supposedly flew into a giant polar opening and saw an inner world with civilizations. Remember, he wasn't just leading the operation, he was an active aviator at the time too. This mainly stemmed off mistranslations of Byrd's foreign interviews and supposed diary entries of Byrd himself. We know that Byrd actually did have a diary, but there have been many claims on the supposed lost entries or new diaries of his that have made such ideas come to life. There are several claims that Admiral Byrd did have a hidden diary with more information on what he saw in the center of the Earth, but those specific diaries are very supposed. There are also claims that Operation Highjump was to destroy or at least investigate secret German Nazi bases within Antarctica from World War II. The scale of Operation Highjump to Little America 4's sudden departure and early termination has led some to suggest that something happened during the operation that led to some kind of retreat. We do know Germany had exploratory missions in what they called Queen Maud Land, New Swabia, from around 1938 to 39, leading to fringe theories or books linking the two. Perhaps the Nazis did set up a base on those lands that they claimed in Antarctica, where Queen Maud Land, being Antarctic land claims Nazi Germany made within Antarctica from and before or around World War II. Some even link the rat lines, the many Nazis that escaped convictions and judgment from and after World War II. They perhaps escaped to these faraway bases. Of course, there's still a lot of speculation here. A lot of this has not been confirmed. But due to those knowledge gaps, we see some of these ideas come to light. Perhaps Little America 4 was only utilized for around 6 to 10 weeks instead of months, simply because they found what they were looking for. These same fringe books or theories also make such claims that this operation was a front to claim hidden UFO technology or alien artifacts that lay dormant under the ice. This idea is based off previous Antarctic expeditions and how Operation Highjump had such a massive scale leap. Remember, previous Little Americas had only 50 to 120 personnel, and then a sudden jump to 4,700. Perhaps those previous trips did see something out there, some alien technology or ship, or something unknown under the ice, and the US needed to recover it then and fast. Byrd's alleged warning of polar threats, with the scales shifting, can also be seen as Cold War preemptive strikes against the USSR. Remember, this is at the dawn of the Cold War, and with the technological race ramping up, perhaps the US simply wanted to show military might and capability to dissuade any potential of strikes coming from or across the ice. Even more fringe theories suggest a battle took place during this operation, hence the quick leave and retreat. This is perhaps the most realistic one, but there's still no evidence fully backing most, if not any, of these ideas I just mentioned. So, we covered the facts on what the operation was and what it claimed to be. We then covered its knowledge gaps, what was weird about the operation, and what we didn't get compared to its sister operations when it came time for declassification. And we also saw how the US did in fact make such bases for military use alone, under the claim of research. So, it's no wonder that such speculation and ideas exist. What do you guys think? Was this a simple logistics and science operation blown out of proportion? Were the facts stretched intentionally to make frisk claims? Or is there more evidence to suggest that maybe some of those theories are true? Either way, the information in regards to this giant operation are summarized a little too much, and it's still one of the largest Antarctic expeditions to date. So that is a little interesting. Research, or perhaps secret civilizations? Let's take a cryptid clue.